Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are stepping into the ring for what is just a high-stakes verbal sparring match. We're looking at a clash of worldviews so intense, it feels less like a conversation and, well, more like a collision between two different universes. On one side, you've got a believer named Brandon, who calls into a show claiming he has a guarantee absolute proof that God exists.
And on the other, the host, Matt Dillahunty, he's famous for demanding really rigorous, tangible evidence.
It's just a battle of logic, of history, and the very nature of what truth even is.
It really is a fascinating case study because you have two people looking at the exact same concepts, contracts, historical data, ancient math.
And seeing two completely contradictory realities.
Exactly. It's not just a disagreement. It's a total breakdown of how we even define proof.
Right. And the core question they're fighting over is simple, but it's massive. Can you prove God exists using the logic of, say, a business contract, or ancient prophecies, or a specific Bible translation? So today we're going to strip away the emotion of the debate and really analyze the logical structures that both sides are using. We're going to see how a believer constructs a guarantee of truth, and then how a skeptic just systematically dismantles it piece by piece.
And this isn't just about theology. It's about how we all process information. When does a coincidence become a miracle?
When does a historical document become a divine contract?
That's the real mission of this deep dive, to understand that gap.
The source for all this is a transcript from A Call on the Atheist Experience, a segment called Evidence for God Guarantees Best Call Ever. And it is a wild ride, but before we get into this buried gold logic, which, trust me, is a total roller coaster, I just have a quick request. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
Okay, so let's get into the first argument. Brandon opens with a scenario that sounds more like a heist movie.
Or a business seminar, yeah.
Yeah.
Not a theological debate at all.
Not at all.
He kicks it off with this analogy about gold. He asks Matt, the host, to imagine a scenario. Brandon has buried $30 million worth of gold. And he goes up to Matt and says, if you help me dig it up, I'll give you 30%. Then he asks the big question. Would you want me to draw up a contract for our agreement?
It's a really fascinating setup because you can tell Brandon is trying to lay a trap. He wants to draw this parallel between a legal contract and, the Bible.
Right. And Matt, being a skeptic but also a practical guy, just says, yes, absolutely. But here is where it gets tricky. Matt says he wants the contract for legal protection.
Of course.
In case Brandon tries to screw him on the deal, he wants to make sure he actually gets his cut. Which makes sense, right? If I'm digging for gold, I want it in writing.
Ideally, yeah.
Yeah.
But you have to listen to why Brandon thinks the contract matters. He argues the real reason for it is wisdom.
Wisdom.
He says wisdom dictates writing things down so that the story doesn't change.
The story doesn't change.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's saying if it's written, it's fixed. It's immutable.
Precisely. And here comes the pivot. Brandon connects this immediately to the Bible. He argues that the Old and New Testaments, or covenants, are essentially God putting everything down in writing. So, in his view, God wrote it all down to make sure the narrative stayed uncorrupted. The Bible, to him, is that contract that keeps the story straight.
But wait a second. Matt isn't buying this at all. He points out a fundamental flaw in the analogy that I think is really, really important.
Right.
Matt says contracts exist precisely because people don't trust each other. You write a contract because you suspect the other person might try to change the deal. But faith, usually, implies trust. So if you need a contract, doesn't that mean you don't have faith?
That's one layer of the problem. But there's a deeper logical fallacy here that Matt gets to. It's about, external verification. Think about it. Does the contract prove the gold actually exists?
No, not at all. The contract just proves that two people agreed to split some gold if they find it. I could write a contract right now saying I'll give you 50% of the gold in my backyard. We could sign it, we can notarize it, but if I don't have any gold,
then the contract is completely worthless. And that is Matt's entire point. Brandon is using the Bible, the contract, to prove God the gold. But you have to prove the gold exists before the contract even matters.
it's totally circular reasoning. The book is true because the book says it's true.
Exactly. Matt says before you even get to the contract, the Bible, you have to prove the gold is real. You have to prove God exists before you can use his supposed contract as any kind of evidence.
So when that business analogy starts to crumble, Brandon pivots. He moves from business logic to historical consensus. He throws out a statistic.
Yeah, he says over 75% of all scholars and historians can agree that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person.
This is such a classic move in apologetics. It's an appeal to authority.
It is. If the experts agree on the premise, then the conclusion must be true.
Well, Matt's response is hilarious. First, he jokes that 93% of statistics are pulled out of, thin air. But then he actually addresses the logic. He grants the premise.
Yeah.
He says, okay, let's pretend 100% of scholars agree Jesus was a real guy. What does that actually prove?
And that is the critical logical gap. The distinction here is just so vital. Existence does not equal divinity.
Not at all.
There is a massive leap between there was a guy named Jesus who existed, and that guy was the creator of the universe.
Right. I mean, lots of people were real. Julius Caesar was real. Matt points out that lots of people were even crucified. He says people have been killed for heresy throughout history. Just because you claim to be God and then get killed for it doesn't make you God.
It just makes you a martyr for your belief. Exactly. David Koresh was a real person. Joseph Smith was a real person. The historical argument only ever gets you to a human figure. It validates the man, but it offers zero evidence for the God.
So Brandon sees that the history argument isn't landing. He needs something that feels undeniable, something that feels like math. So he pulls out his biggest gun, biblical prophecy.
Specifically from the book of Daniel.
Yeah.
Now, this is where we get into the weeds, so we should probably slow down a bit. This is a very, very popular argument in certain circles. Brandon is basically claiming that the Bible predicts the future with mathematical precision.
Okay, so lay it out for me. What's the actual math?
Brandon claims the book of Daniel was written between 603 and 606 BC, and he says this book predicts the Messiah will enter Jerusalem exactly 483 years later. And if you run the numbers, he claims, it aligns perfectly down to the very day with when Jesus entered Jerusalem.
So to him, this is the smoking gun. Math doesn't lie.
Right.
If I predict something 500 years in advance and it happens on the exact day, it's, well, that's spooky. That feels supernatural.
Well, Matt disputes the facts first. He contests the dating of the book. A lot of scholars think Daniel was written much later. And he also points out the text doesn't explicitly name Jesus. It talks about a Messiah, but connecting that to Jesus requires interpretation. But the most interesting part isn't even the dating dispute.
It's the self-fulfilling prophecy argument. This kind of blew my mind.
It's a very strong counterargument. Matt's point is that if a prophecy is written down and known by a culture like the Jewish people having the book of Daniel, they can just act to fulfill it on purpose.
Oh, I see. So if you know the book says, the Messiah will ride into town on a donkey in exactly 483 years, and you want to be the Messiah.
Or you want people to believe your leader is the Messiah.
You could just look at the calendar.
Exactly. You check the date, you go find a donkey, and you ride into town.
Matt uses this hilarious analogy about a baby name. He says, imagine if he predicts on his show, in 1 year, a child will be born and named Matt is awesome. So he makes this prediction. A fan hears it and thinks, hey, I want to make this come true. So a year later, they have a kid and name him Matt is awesome.
Now, was that supernatural prophecy? Did Matt see the future?
No, it was just someone following instructions.
Precisely. The existence of the prediction caused the event. It wasn't a glimpse into the future, it was a script.
He also uses the ordering a steak analogy. If you go to a restaurant and order a steak medium rare, and the waiter brings you a medium rare steak,
That's not prophecy.
it's just an order being filled.
Exactly.
That is such a good point. Brandon tries to argue that the people involved are different, separated by hundreds of years. But Matt's point stands. The text survived. The script was available to the actors. If Jesus and his followers knew the book of Daniel, which they obviously did, they could have orchestrated the whole thing to match the text perfectly.
So the prophecy argument just hits a wall. You can't prove it wasn't staged. The math isn't proof of God. It's just proof that people can count.
At this point, you can feel Brandon getting frustrated. The contract failed. The history failed. The math failed. So the conversation takes this sharp turn towards textual purity.
Yes, the King James only defense. This is a fascinating subgroup within Christianity. Brandon claims that the 1611 King James Version, the Cambridge edition, is the only real Bible.
Yeah, he goes hard on this. He doesn't just say it's the best version. He says all other versions are trash. But then he goes even further. He says the original source texts, the Hebrew, the Greek, the Dead Sea Scrolls, he says you could throw all of those in the trash too.
And this is where the logic becomes very difficult to follow. He's essentially arguing that a 17th century English translation is superior to the ancient manuscripts it was translated from.
That sounds completely backward.
It is. Imagine we have the original manuscript of a Shakespeare play, and then we have a German translation from 300 years later. Brandon is saying, throw away the original. The German translation is the only true Shakespeare.
Matt is just incredulous. He calls it extreme cherry picking. He asks, so we can toss out the things it was based on and just go with this one. It seems to hurt his own case for history.
It's all about certainty. If you rely on ancient scrolls, you have to deal with nuances, with translation errors, with fragments. It's messy. Brandon wants a guarantee. He wants a book he can hold in his hand and say, every word of this is perfect.
So he invents a theology to support it.
Right. Brandon's defense is that God is capable of speaking any language, so he chose English in 1611 to finalize his word. But logically, as Matt points out, it requires discarding the very historical evidence that Christians usually use to prove the Bible's antiquity. You can't have it both ways.
This leads to the final showdown, the personal challenge. Matt asks a question that just cuts through all the theology and all the math. He asks, if God is capable of revealing himself, why hasn't he revealed himself to me directly?
This is the problem of divine hiddenness. If God wants a relationship, why is he hiding?
Brandon's first instinct is what you might call the destroying defense. He says God can't reveal himself without physically destroying the person. He's just too powerful.
But Matt knows his Bible, and he immediately counters with the story of Saul on the road to Damascus. God reveals himself to Saul in a blinding light.
And Saul isn't destroyed, he's converted.
Right, he becomes the Apostle Paul.
So Brandon has to pivot again. He suggests that maybe Matt is a chosen vessel, like Paul was. Maybe he just doesn't know it yet.
But Matt pushes back hard. He just says, God has not revealed himself to me, period, full stop.
And this leads to the climax, the lost glasses analogy. Brandon says, God has revealed himself to you, you just don't see it yet. He compares Matt to someone looking for their glasses while they're already wearing them.
This is such a crucial moment. It highlights two completely different ways of processing reality. Brandon is arguing for a kind of hidden revelation. The evidence is there, but you need a spiritual awakening to see it. It's right on your face.
But Matt absolutely rejects this. He just destroys the analogy. He says, in the glasses scenario, I am the one who finds the glasses using my own senses.
Right. Think about the physical act. If I'm looking for my glasses on my face, how do I know they're there? I reach up and touch them. I use empirical evidence.
Matt argues that claiming the evidence is there, you just don't see it, is a non-falsifiable position. It's a logical trap. If I say, I don't see God, the believer just says, that's because you weren't looking right. It insulates the claim from ever being disproven.
Matt calls it nonsensical. He says, how can it be possible that something has been revealed to you and yet you don't see it?
Yeah, that's a good point. If I send you a text message but your phone never gets it, can I really say I communicated with you?
Exactly. Revelation has to include the recognition of the observer. If the observer doesn't see it, it wasn't revealed. It might have been broadcast, but it wasn't received.
So the call just ends in a total standoff. Brandon is convinced the prophecy is real and the revelation is obvious. Matt is convinced the prophecy is just a script and the revelation is non-existent.
And it's funny, Brandon actually suggests Matt should go call the Jewish experience to argue about why Jews don't accept Jesus if the prophecy is so clear, which is a surprisingly fair point.
It really is. If the prophecy was so mathematically undeniable, why does the Jewish scholars of the time, who knew the text better than anyone, accept it? Why is there still a debate 2,000 years later?
So where does this leave us? We've gone from business contracts about buried gold to historical stats, to Daniel, the King James Bible, and finally to the psychology of seeing the truth.
It leaves us with this stark illustration of the core tension. One side views the Bible as a self-authenticating legal document of the universe.
And the other side views it as a collection of claims that require external verification.
For Brandon, the contract proves the gold exists. For Matt, you have to dig up the gold before the contract is worth the paper it's written on.
And neither side can cross that bridge because they're starting with fundamentally different axioms about what counts as valid evidence.
It really makes you think about how we construct our own beliefs. Are we just writing contracts for gold we haven't dug up yet?
That is the danger, isn't it? We crave certainty. Brandon craved it so much he was willing to throw away ancient manuscripts just to have one perfect English book.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. It comes back to that self-fulfilling prophecy idea. The Matt is awesome, baby.
It's a haunting question.
If a prediction is written down and known by a culture, is it ever really possible to prove it was fulfilled supernaturally?
Or does the very existence of the prediction make its fulfillment just inevitable by human hands?
If we have the script, are we just acting out the play and calling it destiny?
That is something worth thinking deeper about.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We'll see you next time.